You know, when you think about old-school governments, what comes to mind? Probably kings in big castles, right? Emperors on fancy thrones. Well, that's really just scratching the surface. The real story is so much more diverse. So let's get into it and explore the incredible ways humanity has figured out how to govern itself.
This is the fundamental question, isn't it? Every single civilization, big or small, has had to wrestle with this. It doesn't matter if you're a tiny farming village or a massive, sprawling empire, you've got to have a system to make things work.
And what's so fascinating is that when you peel back all the layers, you find that pretty much every government is trying to solve the same basic problems. You've got to protect your people from outsiders, right? You need to manage important stuff like water or food. You have to make sure everyone gets fed, and you got to keep things from falling into chaos. The problems themselves, they're totally universal.
But the solutions? Oh man, that's where things get really interesting. They were anything but universal. The sheer creativity people have shown when it comes to governance it's just staggering. So, come on, let's take a little tour of some of the most amazing and sometimes bizarre systems humans have ever come up with.
All right, so let's start with a classic, the one we all know, putting a single person in charge of the whole show. This idea of one powerful leader, well, it's one of the most common threads you'll find woven throughout all of human history.
And that, of course, is monarchy. For a huge chunk of history, this was the default setting for government. And leaders, well, they got pretty creative justifying why they should be the one in charge. In Europe, you had kings claiming divine right, basically saying God himself put them on the throne. And it wasn't just them. The Mongol Khans, for instance, were convinced that heaven had given them the green light to rule the entire world.
But here's the thing. The job description for king could be wildly different depending on where you were. A European king? Yeah, he was a political guy, a military leader for sure. But now let's jump over to the Maya. Their king, the Ahau, was also called the Holy Lord. And he wasn't just a ruler, he was the state shaman. His job included performing public bloodletting rituals to talk to the gods and make sure the crops grew. Same title, king, but two completely different worlds.
And this wasn't just a European or Asian thing. Just look at this map of Africa. It shows you just how common monarchies were all across the continent. You had these powerful single rulers governing huge, diverse kingdoms from Ghana all the way over in the west to Ethiopia in the east. And each one had its own unique flavor, its own traditions of power. And the rituals that went along with these kingships? Absolutely incredible. They were all designed to show that the ruler was way, way above ordinary folks. In the Ghana Empire, for example, if you approached the emperor, you had to kneel down and pour dust on your own head as a sign of respect. Or think about the emperor of Ethiopia. He didn't have a palace, he ruled from a massive, moving capital made of up to 6,000 tents. And get this, in Great Zimbabwe, the job came with the ultimate responsibility. If the emperor got too old or sick to rule well, he was actually expected to commit suicide. Talk about high stakes.
Okay, so rule by one person makes a certain kind of sense, but that's not the only way to do it. What happens when you spread the power out a little bit, but not too much? What if it's not one person in charge, but a small, exclusive group? Well, now we're stepping into the world of oligarchies and elites.
A great example of this comes from the Renaissance. A lot of those famous Italian city-states were basically run as oligarchies. All the power was held by a handful of people, usually the richest merchants in town. And they'd often call their government a republic, but it was a very selective republic. And this chart really drives home just how exclusive we're talking about. Take a look at Florence. You've got a city of around 40,000 people, but only 2,500 of them actually got to vote. And believe it or not, that was considered a broad oligarchy. Now check out Venice. The city's population was 4 times bigger, but the number of voters, exactly the same. We're talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of the people holding all the cards.
Now, let's hop across the ocean because a totally different kind of rule by a few was happening in North America. We call it a chiefdom. It was still a hierarchical society, and the chief inherited his position, but it was a lot less formal than your typical kingdom. You didn't have this huge, sprawling government bureaucracy.
In the incredible Mississippian cultures, for instance, the chief and his family were the absolute elite. They were the ones who controlled all the surplus food, they led the most sacred rituals, and they were quite literally raised above everyone else. They were carried around in special litters just to show off their status.
Okay, so we've covered rule by one person and rule by a small group. But what's really cool is that some of the most powerful and long-lasting societies in history had a completely different approach. They weren't ruled by a person or even a group. They were ruled by systems, by laws, and sometimes even by the community as a whole.
Let's talk about the Mongol Empire. Yeah, we all know they were unstoppable conquerors, but what held the biggest land empire in history together? It wasn't just brute force. It was a seriously sophisticated system. They had a unified legal code called the Yasa, and it demanded absolute honesty. If you found something someone lost and didn't return it, that could be a death sentence. That level of discipline was baked into their entire military and their government, and it's how they managed to rule over millions of people.
And this is a fantastic comparison because it shows two totally different blueprints for building a stable society. Over in India, you had the mandala state model. Power there came from a divine king and flowed out through sacred temples. But then you look at China, and it's the Confucian state. This was run by a professional, non-religious bureaucracy. The emperor was in charge, sure, but he had to keep the mandate of heaven. If things went badly, it was seen as a sign he'd lost the mandate, and poof, he could be overthrown.
But that raises a huge question. Do you even need a formal government to have an orderly society? Turns out, maybe not. In many parts of medieval Africa, there were thriving communities that we call stateless societies. They didn't have kings or presidents. Land was managed cooperatively by everyone. In crime, there were no police. It was handled through social pressure, basically the fear of being shunned or kicked out. And when disputes did pop up, they were often handled by secret societies, these little groups based on family or work that acted as the unofficial judges.
And this idea of a system-based rule brings us right back to those Italian city-states. Their invention, the Republic, was another grand experiment. Yeah, it was still dominated by the wealthy citizens, but here's the key. Officials were often chosen by election or sometimes even by just drawing lots, and they could only serve for a limited time. The whole point was to prevent any single person or family from getting way too powerful.
Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour through a ton of history. But you might be wondering, why does any of this old stuff matter today? Well, it matters because all of these ancient experiments with power have left echoes that you can still hear loud and clear in our world right now.
Think about it, we've really seen the whole spectrum, haven't we? We've seen power concentrated in the hands of just one person, your monarchs and chiefs. We've seen it shared among a select few, the oligarchies. We've seen societies that put their trust in systems and laws. And we've even seen power spread out across the entire community.
So what's the big takeaway here? I think it's this. There's no single best way to run a society. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every single one of these systems was a custom-built answer to a unique set of circumstances, a specific time, a specific culture, and its own unique problems.
But there's a common thread that ties them all together. At the end of the day, it didn't matter if you were William the Conqueror making the Doomsday Book to figure out what he just conquered, or an Incan official using knotted strings called quipus to count people. To rule effectively, you've always needed two things: good information and a good way to stay organized.
And that brings us to a final question for you to think about. Just look around at the world today. Listen to the debates we're having about leadership, about who the experts are, about the rule of law, about community power. Which of these ancient patterns do you see playing out right now, in our own time? Because the story of how we govern ourselves, well, it's not over. Not by a long shot. In fact, we're all writing the next chapter as we speak.